You remember our subject-verb-object, and it looks like a nice theory, but we're going to see how it works in real life, in a real story by Charles Dickens. These easy classics are really, really good for learning English, right? So let's take a look. Here we have Scrooge had a small fire. Now let's go back to our little picture here and our subject-verb-object down here. This is one idea, remember? The idea is Scrooge had a small fire. So who had what? Who had what? Who had what? Scrooge had a small fire. And look, they even put a little picture in here, right? It was, that's this one. The money is on the table. It was so tiny that its heat barely left the fireplace. Barely means not much. Tiny is small, right? So it was so tiny is actually a subject-verb-object, right? It, subject, verb, so tiny, object. Now that tells you we're going to find out why it was so tiny. How tiny was it? Well, it was so tiny that its heat barely left the fireplace. Okay, so what is the subject? Its heat is the subject. So its heat, now we know its heat is the subject. So its heat is, its heat did, or its heat was, or needed, or had, something like that, right? So its heat left. This means, this is the verb. It means here's the heat around here, and you can see it's small, right? So the heat didn't leave the fireplace. It barely left, only a little bit, the fireplace. So its heat is the subject, verb to leave the fireplace. Again, two ideas here, two subject-verb objects. It was tiny, and its heat barely left the fireplace. Yeah. So just tells us so tiny. It was how much tiny was it, or how tiny was it? It was so tiny that its heat barely left the fireplace. Okay, so this is a little bit of a strange word, but the clerk, it's like the accountant counts the money. The clerk, so we know that's the subject. Put on his white woolen scarf. The clerk put on, what did he put on? His white woolen scarf. And now, we haven't seen this before. So the clerk put on his white woolen scarf. That's this one. Wool is the kind of material. And tried to warm himself. So the clerk put on and tried. That verb goes with that subject. So here we have a, how can we do this? A subject, verb, object, verb, object, because the subject does this and the subject does that, right? So here we have Bob Cratchit, and he's the clerk, and he put on something and tried to something. Tried to warm himself, right? So here we have another little thing here. We have the clerk, comma, whose name was Bob Cratchit. And a comma. Why are these commas here? They're very important. Because they are taking whose name was Bob Cratchit and separating them from the subject and the verb. They're adding more information. But look at this. Whose name was Bob Cratchit. Subject, verb, object. So when you go back and I showed you this little picture and I said there was a girl and there was money and it's in your mind and you need to know who is the subject verbing what, this is why. Because you have to do this, choose the subject does what to the object over and over and over and over again in English. That is how native speakers think. We don't think like that or like that. Okay, so let's finish this page. The clerk, whose name was Bob Cratchit, and you'll hear a little pause there, put on his white woolen scarf and tried to warm himself by the flame of his candle. So by is a preposition. By is telling us how he tried to warm himself. So he tried to warm himself how? By the flame of his candle, right? So the author is creating a feeling here of this picture. Here he is with his scarf. Here he is with the candle, and he's trying to use a tiny, tiny, tiny little candle to heat himself. So he's so cold, right? And we can see that as well from the picture. Look at how mean he is. Scrooge, right? Okay. And in the end, the last one, it, meaning this situation, it did not work. That is just subject verb. It did not work. Okay? So when you think in English, in the next video, I'm going to tell you how to practice this.